host, Preston. Today we are in the all-new Range Rover Sport. That's right, this is the 2023 Range Rover Sport. This particular trim level, the P400 Dynamic SE. I'm going to give you some of my first initial impressions after having taken delivery of the vehicle about a week and a half ago now. I have about 248 miles on the Range Rover Sport, so I'd like to think I have a little bit of an idea of how the thing is to drive and how to live with. What is the Range Rover Sport? And if you're not really familiar with the Land Rover Range Rover lineup, this sort of sits under full-size Range Rover, but above Range Rover Velar, so I'll go into some of those things in detail. But the long and short of it is this is a very, very important vehicle for Land Rover. It is an absolute staple within their lineup. If some of you might remember, those that are familiar with Land Rover Range Rover, big enthusiasts like I am, back when the original Sport came out in 2007, that was actually based on the old Discovery, very heavy, kind of chunky vehicle. The word sport in the name didn't really mean that much other than to really designate it up and above some of those lower trim levels that Land Rover had back then, whether it be the LR2, LR3, etc. But what is the Range Rover Sport? The Range Rover Sport is really exactly what the name says, or at least allegedly what the name says, and it is the sportier version of the Range Rover. So it's not necessarily a Range Rover Junior or really a giant step under in terms of luxury. Question is, does this new Range Rover Sport live up to its name? Is it indeed a Range Rover Sport? Can you really get on it and enjoy it around the corners and on some nice driving roads and so on? Or is it really just a Range Rover Junior? I guess is the big question that I am looking for the answer to in my ownership of this vehicle. I have quite a bit of seat time in the new Range Rover Sport over the last few years. I had a 2019 Range Rover Sport supercharged V8 Dynamic, and some of the naming and the nomenclature has changed, so you have to bear with me on that. It can get a little bit confusing. Land Rover sort of had an overhaul with some of their naming systems and so on, but essentially back in 2019, it was the V8 supercharged Dynamic that I had, and that had the 5-liter supercharged V8 that I really love. I talked about that in the Defender V8 video. That sort of heralded from the same unit. I also had a 2021 Range Rover Sport SVR that was also featured on this channel. That was the British Racing Green with the exposed carbon and so on. That Range Rover Sport has been phased out. So this is the new Range Rover Sport, built from the ground up. It shares the chassis of the full-size Range Rover. And obviously everybody knows the full-size Range Rover. That's the Big Daddy Range Rover. That is essentially the SUV to beat on the road as far as I'm concerned in terms of combination of usability, practicality, and just daily comfort, 24/7 use. Really the Swiss Army SUV, right? You can do everything with it. So the question is, where does the Range Rover Sport really fit in the lineup? Now, it's no secret that the Range Rover Sport, like pretty much every other vehicle in the market these days, is getting heavier and heavier and bigger, right? And just from the outset, when I went to go take delivery of this vehicle last week, I could tell this thing was a chunker. It's much bigger, I think more wide, and has a lot more road presence than the outgoing Sport. Taking my corner here, but it really maintains, I think, some pretty nice dynamicism and agility. And despite the fact that it weighs 200 to 300 pounds more than the outgoing Sport that I had, I think it makes up for it in spades, particularly in the way that the chassis engineers set this vehicle up, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm going around one of my favorite corners here. It's kind of a tight corner. It's a 25 or 30 mark corner. I'm going in at about 45 or 50, and the Sport feels a lot more tied down to me to the surface than the last Sport, and that is partially true to the new 4-wheel steer system they had in this. So that's all new on this new Range Rover Sport. It is 4-wheel steer. It helps with that turning radius, at slow speeds. Obviously you get the opposite lock, but at high speeds, cornering, obviously it turns the same way as the front wheel, so your curb weight really feels like it's being dramatically reduced. This is a very heavy vehicle, as I said. It's right, I believe, just shy of 5,000 pounds, so it's quite a chunker, but it's amazing to me, how far the technology's come and how far the engineering's come, that you can really set up these big hefty SUVs to give you a rewarding driving experience, so that's what you're looking for. And having lived with the vehicle for a week, I can tell you, and I've talked about this a little bit with the Jaguar SVR, and even the Defender and the old Sport, the reason why I love these Range Rovers and you know, the JLR products so much, especially the performance-oriented ones, is that they really do everything. They really offer you great daily drivability, and you notice that as soon as you get into this new Sport. This one's spec'd with the 23-inch sort of SV wheels, but that notwithstanding, it still feels like a relatively it's an absolutely luxurious magic carpet-like ride. It's much smoother than the Sport Dynamic V8 that I had of the last generation. I'm not sure whether the engineers, you know, despite the name Sport Dynamic, this is supposed to be the sportier chassis setup, and I'll talk about some of the sort of the trim levels in a second. This is supposed to be the more taut and handling oriented Range Rover Sport, but it still really feels good, just kind of putting along in whether it's, you know, stop and go traffic and so on. Luckily I'm on some nicer roads now where I can really sort of exploit the performance, but it feels really, really good when you get in. You know, steering, I wouldn't say it's the most connected thing, but you know where the car is going to be when you place it. It's no 911 GT3 obviously, but it feels pretty good. You get some steering feel, but obviously highly electrically assisted. Probably more so than the SVR that I had, a little bit less feel, but it still feels pretty good. Came out the power plant a little bit. This is a P400, so if you watch the review that I did on the P400 Defender that I had, the Pangea green one, we also had the one back in 2020. It was also the P400. So this is a straight 6 motor, 400 horsepower, and it's coupled to that 48 volt mild supercharger / alternator. It sort of helps with that torque fill that you get from a standalone turbo motor. Notice that the P400 motor in this Range Rover Sport has quite a bit more poke than it did in the Defender, the Pangea green P400 Defender that I had. And, you know, I think that that's highly attributable to that weight gap. And the Defender is a very heavy vehicle. I don't think a lot of people realize how heavy it is. The Defender, at least the V8 one that I had, was approaching, I think it was up there, it was like 5,600 pounds. That's substantial. That's a full 600 or so pounds heavier than this Range Rover Sport, and that's a big difference, at least that I have noticed performance-wise with this engine. This P400 motor really gets a move on in this particular Range Rover Sport, the Dynamic SE that I have. I think 0 to 60 from factory is quoted around 5.1 seconds. We can see that now. Yeah, I didn't even really, that wasn't really full throttle. It was probably about at least 3/4, but it feels really good. You definitely have tons of passing power. I'm not really feeling myself yearning for the V8. And speaking of the V8, I'll get into some of the trim levels in a second. So this sort of sits in the middle of the trim level offerings. P360, the naming is a little bit different in the UK versus the US, but you have a standalone sort of petrol 360. It's just the straight 6 with 360 horsepower. You do not get the 48 volt alternator / mild supercharger that you have in the Dynamic Mild. This is what I have. So I have the P400. It's the Dynamic SE, which has that straight 6, 48 volt combination that makes you the 400 horsepower. And then there's also the Sport Autobiography, and this is where it gets kind of interesting. So it's quite a bit different. On the outgoing Range Rover Sport, you could get the straight 6 P400, but when you had the Autobiography in the past gen, you were forced to get the 5-liter supercharged V8. That 5-liter supercharged V8 is gone. That's the famous supercharged V8 that JLR has come to sort of become famous for. That's on the way out, and what has replaced it is the 4.4-liter V8. However, at least in the United States, the 4.4-liter V8 is not available on the Autobiography. So on the Autobiography, it's actually a P440e. It's a plug-in hybrid. So you get the straight 6 that's in this Dynamic SE that I have, combined with a plug-in unit. So I don't remember the exact kilowatt-hour battery right now, but it's a plug-in hybrid making 440 horsepower, hence the P440. If you want to get the V8, you're pigeonholed into the first edition, at least right now. There's no SVR yet, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So the first edition is powered by the 4.4 liter V8. It's actually sourced from BMW, and that particular unit makes around 530 horsepower, give or take. So it's pretty interesting, obviously, that pretty much every brand, unfortunately, at least for me, you know, as a car enthusiast, is moving away from these V8s. You can't really select them a la carte throughout the lineup like you used to in the Range Rover lineup, which kind of upsets me a little bit. But I do have to say, like I said, this is a very good power plant. I think it suits this Range Rover nicely. Obviously, 8-speed CF automatic. Just gets better and better, basically, with each iteration of JLR product that I drive. The shift points are awesome. I think that, you know, it's really not lumpy or anything at slow gears. It really rips off shift nicely for being the automatic, and I always say that really it's the closest thing that you can get to a dual clutch transmission. And the reason why, you know, this, obviously there's a size difference, but you know, something like a Porsche Macan has a dual clutch, but you have to have the 8-speed ZF or an auto box to maintain the towing capacity, and the towing capacity is pretty decent on this. I can't remember it offhand, but you could you could tow a sizable, you know, small boat with this, or jet skis, for example, if you're into that kind of thing. But the P400 is plenty for me for daily driving. Would I get the V8? Of course I would, and the answer is I would not. I think the best place for your money, however, when you're talking about value, is in the P400 Dynamic SE. I think you get a nice combination of performance, some of these luxury trim features. You can see this is called the upholstery is called Light Cloud, sort of a beautiful kind of gray off-whitish color. You can really spec it up nicely, and it comes pretty well loaded with features. I had a couple options that I did. I think I showed it at the beginning. So it's called SV Bespoke chopped carbon. You can see the trim along the doors. So I also have it. I have my water bottle here now, but there's actually a cup holder cover that is covered in chopped carbon fiber, which is pretty funny. As far as I know, it's the only vehicle with chopped carbon fiber outside of the Lamborghini Huracan Performante and Huracan STO. So the more you know. So let's talk a little bit more about which Range Rover you should choose. And I watched Harry Metcalf's review of this new Sport, and I kind of want to touch on some of the points that he made about it, because I have a lot of respect for him. I think he's probably one of the best names in the automotive journalism industry. He's very honest about the products that he reviews. And he talked about the Range Rover and Range Rover Sport and sort of that kind of confusing overlap in the lineup. And I have to say I agree with him a little bit in terms of the differences between the two vehicles. As I said, the name Sport to me really designates more of, I guess, Range Rover's naming system more than necessarily the driving characteristics of this new Sport. And like I said, it does handle well. Things around corners, it feels pretty good. No doubt it's probably a little bit more nimble than the full-size Range Rover. But to call something Sport, you expect it to be what the name says, right? It's Sport. And it does not really feel sporty. It's big, it's wide, you can feel the weight. Yes, the four-wheel steer does help reduce some of its heft, but I don't feel like I'm in something, you know, like that's actually sporty, like a Cayenne Turbo GT or something like that, or an Urus, for example. And those are sporty SUVs, or something like an Audi RS Q8. This is much more. I don't want to call it a Range Rover Light, because I think that would be a little bit insulting to it. I think that what it offers is fantastic. It's just basically a little bit smaller Range Rover. You feel more coupe-like. You do feel like you're in a more sporty driving position. I will say the seats are still really comfortable, etc. You maintain the Windsor leather, heated and cooled seats, all those creature comforts and so on. But you definitely don't feel like you're in a race car, put it that way. And Sport SVR. The SVR to me felt a lot more sporty than this, and a lot of that was due to that 5-liter V8, you know, supercharged, the soundtrack and so on. And it does get a move on. So what are some of the likes and dislikes of the new Range Rover Sport for me? Start off with a couple of dislikes. I have to say, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, cars are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and this Range Rover Sport, the new one, is no exception to that. It is noticeably larger than the last Sport. You know, obviously the driving presence and the on-road presence makes up for that. But the casualty of getting bigger and bigger and bigger is that your handling and your driving dynamics and on-road capabilities obviously go down. And to me, that this Range Rover Sport feels a lot more Range Rover to me than Range Rover Sport. And that's a good thing in some ways, and it's a bad thing in some way. Obviously, talking about the dislikes, I don't feel that this is as taut around corners and in performance-driven situations, at least as my old SVR, and maybe not even as much as the supercharged dynamic that I had. So it's really just that weight penalty that is the big dislike for me from the start. Second dislike, I don't know if it looks as aggressive as it used to. You can let me know in the comments if you agree. I think that it's a little bit rounded off at the front. I think that the rear is a little bit Velar-esque as well as the front. And as a result, this is knocking on the door of Range Rover, as I said, in terms of the dynamics and stuff, and the lines are a little bit blurred. So I sort of question, much like Harry Metcalf, to where the Range Rover Sport sits in the lineup these days, the conventional JLR lineup. And when you're not setting yourself up or setting yourself apart as much in terms of in the sporting department and the on-road dynamics and, you know, performance situation environment, I question, where does the Range Rover Sport really fit? You have things like the Velar, you have the new Defender V8 that is obviously performance oriented. And with the weight penalty and things like that, this is getting very, very close to Range Rover. So the question is, why don't you just go for the full-size Range Rover than this? And I guess the answer would be maybe in the price department. Obviously, this particular Range Rover Sport, the Dynamic SE, this starts at $90,000. This one that I have here stickered right over $100,000 because that chopped carbon, the wheels, the blackout package, etc., heating, cooled seats, front and rear, little odds and ends like that. But the full size starts somewhere around 104. A nicely optioned P400 Range Rover will set you right around 120. So yes, there is that price disparity, obviously. If you're looking for a full-size Range Rover and you don't want to put up all that cash up front, just get a new Range Rover Sport. I mean, is that really a bad conclusion? I don't know, because I just think that they are getting very close in terms of what they offer respectively. So it's a positive and a negative. So that brings me to some of the likes of the Range Rover Sport. I have quite a lot of them. It's just the way that this thing goes down the road. It's absolutely fantastic. It's miles better than the Defender V8, even though that I talked about in that video how smooth it was. And it offers a lot of that dual personality of luxury and brute performance. This Range Rover Sport does that even more. It's not as brutish because it doesn't have the supercharged V8. You have that, you know, I was going to say stuck with. You have that straight six, which still has some character to it, but I mean, nothing's beating a supercharged V8. But the way that this thing goes down the road and just handles itself in all situations, you know, you have what we've all kind of come to know and love. You have all these different driving modes. You have air suspension with access mode, normal mode, and there's an off-road mode which jacks it up for off-road use and so on. It's just a very usable and enjoyable experience when you're driving down the road. And I have to say that one of the first things I noticed, I was joking with my brother, is he was saying to me, you feel much more relaxed when you're on the road with this. You don't feel as many things bother you when you're driving this Range Rover. And it sort of reminds me a lot like if you've ever been in obviously a Rolls-Royce Phantom or something like that. The experience is very serene. There's very little wind noise, very little road noise. It's just a great place to be. And the number two, like, you know, it's a positive and a negative. Looks are subjective. I personally think that the Range Rover Sport does look very good. I think it has a lot of road presence. It's bigger, so it's much more noticeable when it's coming at you. I think it looks menacing when you have the blackout sort of package and the big wheels and stuff on it. But granted, it is a very spec-dependent car, in my opinion. I saw one of the first editions in Frenzy red with some of the smaller wheels. Not personally for me, I thought it looked a lot more like a Velar or even an Evoque at some angles, but it is very spec dependent. But I think if you set it up nicely, it looks awesome. But just to sum up my time, really week and a half into the Range Rover Sport, I really do like it. I plan on keeping it until the order books open for the new Range Rover Sport SVR. I am first on the list for that vehicle when it comes out at my dealer, as well as the Defender SVX, which I'll talk about in a future video. And the Defender SVX is going to be actually a V8 Defender that sits up and above the Defender V8 that I have. So that's all that to come. But just summing up the new Range Rover Sport, I think it's a great product. If you're looking for a great package of really comprehensive luxury features combined with the on-road driving experience that'll be somewhat engaging to you, that you'll enjoy taking out on the weekends as well as out to dinner, I think this is the vehicle for you. I think it really fits in well in a lot of different environments, whether it be the valet or, you know, out in a country picnic, if you're into that sort of thing. Thank you for watching the video. Thank you for tuning into the PCAF. I'm your host, Preston. Thanks for checking out my initial impressions and driving review of my new Range Rover Sport. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the next one.